The security guard's hand was only inches from James Cameron's shoulder when something unexpected happened. A moment that would later shake the entire Christian community and make 50,000 people question everything they had believed for decades. James stood still in the backstage area of Lakewood Church, surrounded by Pastor Joel Osteen's personal security team. But amid that suffocating tension, his piercing blue eyes remained calm, unwavering, almost supernatural. It was the same steely determination he had carried through decades of Hollywood battles, the same resolve that had driven him to the deepest point on earth. This was not acting. This was the real presence of someone who had spent his life confronting impossible odds and winning. "Mr. Cameron," the lead guard spoke, his voice trembling barely audibly. "Pastor Osteen requests that we escort you out of here immediately." But what happened next was not simple defiance. It was not ordinary courage. It was a manifestation of something much deeper. Something that proved James Cameron had not just conquered Hollywood and the ocean depths. He had spent the last 3 months uncovering a truth that could destroy everything Lakewood had built. This was not a scripted scene. This was a real reckoning. While Joel Osteen had spent years preaching the gospel of comfort and financial prosperity, James had spent decades living something completely different. Discipline, integrity, sacrifice. The man who had created Titanic, a film that exposed the obscene gap between rich and poor, was about to do the same thing in real life. The guards expected compliance. They thought the famous director would nod politely, step out quietly, and let silence swallow another inconvenient truth. After all, what did a filmmaker know about theology? What business did Hollywood have in a house of God? But what they did not know, what Osteen himself could never have anticipated, was that James had discovered something that could expose the machinery behind America's most influential prosperity ministry. A secret hidden for decades beneath charming smiles and promises of divine wealth. A truth that challenged not just one preacher, but an entire belief system built on exploiting the desperate. James looked directly at the lead guard. When he spoke, his voice did not need to be loud. It carried the calm power of someone who had weathered storms, both literal and spiritual, who had commanded 1,000-person film crews and stared into the abyss of the Mariana Trench. He smiled, a smile that carried both mercy and righteous warning, and said, "I have something to say to the people, and nothing on this earth can stop me from saying it." What happened next was recorded by dozens of phones, uploaded immediately, and watched by millions within hours. With it came a haunting question, echoing across the Christian world like thunder rolling through mountains. What if everything we have been taught about prosperity and blessing was never true? What if it was just a story constructed to keep us empty while enriching the storytellers? 3 weeks before this moment, James Cameron was sitting in his modest Malibu home when the phone rang. The afternoon sun painted golden streaks across the Pacific Ocean visible through his windows, but James barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by grief that had settled into his bones like a permanent winter. The voice on the other end was Joel Osteen's personal assistant, sweet and enthusiastic like the Lakewood brand itself. "Mr. Cameron," she began, her voice bubbling with carefully rehearsed energy. "This is such a wonderful opportunity for God's kingdom. Pastor Joel wants to invite you to share your story before 50,000 people. Live national television. Millions watching from home. Imagine the impact of that platform." James was silent. His weathered hand gripped the phone tightly as memories flooded through him. Margaret Miller's face, her gentle smile, the way she had always brought homemade cookies to Sarah whenever she visited the set. And then the photograph Sarah had shown him last week, her mother's frozen body found in a cold apartment, wrapped in every blanket she owned. "Mr. Cameron, are you still there?" "Why me?" James finally asked, his voice flat. "I am not exactly known for my religious speeches." The assistant laughed nervously. Pastor Joel believes your influence could inspire millions. Your films have touched so many hearts. Titanic, Avatar, stories of hope and perseverance. He feels your testimony would be incredibly powerful. After the call ended, James sat motionless for a long moment, staring at the framed photograph on his desk. It showed him with his production team from Titanic, arms around each other, celebrating the film's success. Sarah Miller stood in the front row, young and bright-eyed, the assistant who had worked 18-hour days to help him achieve his vision. Sarah's mother, Margaret, had died 3 weeks ago, and the reason for her death had led James down a rabbit hole he never expected to enter. He reached for the thick folders sitting on the table beside his worn Bible. Inside were documents, testimonies, financial records, and letters that painted a picture so disturbing he had barely slept since discovering them. Why now? He whispered to himself. Why me? But deep in his heart, James already knew the answer. Because Margaret Miller had believed Joel Osteen's promises. Because she had given everything she had to Lakewood Church. Because she had died cold and alone while the man who took her money slept in a $10 million mansion. And because James Cameron had never in his life walked away from an injustice he could fight. In the following days, James threw himself into investigation with the same obsessive attention to detail that had made him legendary in Hollywood. He read every Osteen sermon transcript he could find. He examined Lakewood's public financial filings. He listened to countless stories from people who had once believed their donations would unlock divine prosperity, only to end up empty-handed and broken. Kevin Rhodes, his trusted technology expert who had worked on visual effects for 3 of his films, helped him dig deeper into the digital records. Kevin was a brilliant young man in his 30s who had transitioned from Hollywood special effects to cybersecurity consulting, and he approached the investigation with the same intensity he brought to creating impossible worlds on screen. James, you need to see this, Kevin said one night, his face illuminated by the blue glow of multiple computer monitors. Lakewood brought in $70 million last year. $70 million. And their benevolence fund, the money supposedly set aside to help members in need, contained less than $50,000. James leaned forward, studying the spreadsheets. Where did the rest go? Salaries, mostly. Joel's personal compensation was $12 million. Victoria's was $8 million. Their adult children are all employed by the church at 6-figure salaries. And then there are the properties. Kevin pulled up another screen. A $10.5 million mansion in River Oaks, a second home in California worth $4 million, multiple luxury vehicles, private jet expenses. The numbers swam before James's eyes, but it was not the wealth itself that sickened him. He had worked with wealthy people his entire career. He had earned substantial money himself. What turned his stomach was the source of that wealth. People like Margaret Miller. Sarah had given James the letter her mother wrote before she died, 3 pages of shaky handwriting that made his hands tremble as he read. I have given Pastor Joel everything I can, Margaret had written. 6 months of my Social Security checks, $900 each time. He promised that sacrificial seeds would produce a harvest, he said. God would multiply it back to me. I have been eating 1 meal a day to save money for Lakewood. I stopped taking my heart medication because I cannot afford both the pills and the offering. But I believe. I have to believe. Pastor Joel says doubt is what robs us of our blessings. Margaret Miller died on January 15th. The heat in her apartment had been shut off 3 days earlier because she could not pay the bill. Her neighbors found her wrapped in every blanket she owned, her Bible open to Malachi chapter 3, the verse about bringing tithes to the storehouse that Joel quoted every single Sunday. James set the letter down and looked out at the Pacific Ocean, its vastness usually a source of peace for him. But tonight, the water looked cold and indifferent, like the universe Margaret must have felt abandoned by in her final moments. She died believing God had cursed her. Sarah had told him through tears. She thought her poverty meant she did not have enough faith. That is what Joel taught her. That is what killed her. James made his decision that night. He would accept Joel Osteen's invitation. He would stand before 50,000 people and millions more watching from home. But he would not deliver the testimony they expected. He would deliver the truth. The next morning, James called Osteen's assistant back. His voice was calm, measured, betraying nothing of the storm brewing inside him. "Yes," he said simply. "I will come to Lakewood. I will speak to the congregation." The assistant's squeal of delight pierced through the phone. "Oh, Mr. Cameron, this is wonderful. Pastor Joel will be so thrilled. We will prepare everything for you. Scripts, talking points, suggested themes that align with our ministry's message." New. The single word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "I am sorry." The assistant stammered. "No scripts. No pre-approved talking points. I will speak from the heart, led by whatever moves me in that moment. Those are my conditions." There was a long pause. James could almost hear the assistant's mental calculations, weighing the risk against the reward of having a Hollywood legend on their stage. "I will need to confirm with Pastor Joel," she finally said, her voice noticeably cooler. "Take your time." "But those are my only terms." The call came back within the hour. Joel had agreed. After all, who would suspect James Cameron, the visionary director beloved by millions, would do anything but promote their message? He was not a theologian. He was not a religious figure. He was just a filmmaker who made expensive movies about sinking ships and blue aliens. That assumption would prove to be their fatal mistake. Over the following 2 weeks, James assembled his evidence with the meticulous precision of a director preparing for the most important production of his life. Kevin Rhodes worked around the clock, tracing financial connections, verifying documents, building an airtight case that no amount of charm or denial could dismantle. "I found something else," Kevin said during one of their late-night sessions, a former employee willing to talk. She was Lakewood's chief financial officer for 15 years. She has recordings, internal memos, everything. The woman's name was Linda Patterson. She had left Lakewood 2 years earlier, haunted by what she had witnessed, but too afraid to speak publicly. When James contacted her, explaining who he was and what he intended to do, she broke down crying on the phone. "I have been praying for someone to expose this," Linda whispered. "I have carried this burden for so long. The things I saw, Mr. Cameron, the strategies we developed to extract money from the most vulnerable people. It was systematic, it was deliberate, and it was evil disguised as ministry." Linda sent James everything. Audio recordings of staff meetings where Joel discussed giving optimization strategies, internal documents profiling congregation members by their income, debts, and psychological vulnerabilities, training materials teaching employees to use specific phrases designed to bypass logical thinking and trigger emotional responses, with targeted single mothers during back-to-school season. Linda explained in one recording, "When they were most stressed about money, we knew elderly members received Social Security deposits on specific dates, so we scheduled special giving campaigns around those times. We tracked everyone. We knew exactly how much we could extract from each person before they broke." James listened to the recordings in the darkness of his study, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. This was not incompetence. This was not a ministry that had simply lost its way. This was a predatory operation designed from the ground up to exploit human desperation. But the most damning discovery came from an unexpected source. 3 days before the Lakewood event, a package arrived at James's home. There was no return address, only a handwritten note that read, "John Osteen recorded this before he died. His son buried it. The world needs to see it." Inside was a videotape, ancient technology by modern standards, but James had the equipment to play it. What he saw made him sit back in his chair, momentarily unable to breathe. John Osteen, Joel's father and Lakewood's founder appeared on the grainy footage. He was clearly ill, propped up in a hospital bed, speaking directly into the camera with urgent, desperate eyes. "If anyone finds this after I am gone," the elder Osteen said, his voice weak but determined, "know that I fear for what Lakewood might become. My son Joel has gifts, charisma, intelligence, vision. But he has begun to love the spotlight more than the scripture. He sees the church as a business, not a body of believers. I have tried to warn him, but he thinks I am behind the times." John Osteen paused, gathering strength for what came next. "I am leaving this recording as a safeguard. If Lakewood ever stops preaching Christ crucified and starts preaching prosperity, if it ever values money over ministry, if it ever hurts the poor instead of helping them, then someone needs to stop it. Even if that someone has to stop my own son." The video ended with John Osteen praying through tears, asking God to forgive him for any part he might have played in creating what Lakewood could become. James watched the recording 3 times. Here was a father's worst fear, captured on tape and hidden away by the very son he had warned about. Here was proof that everything Joel had built was a betrayal of everything his father had believed. The Sunday arrived gray and humid, typical Houston weather that seemed to press down on everything like a heavy blanket. James flew in the night before, sleeping fitfully in a modest hotel room rather than accepting Lakewood's offer of luxury accommodations. He wanted nothing from them. Not their hospitality, not their money, not their false friendship. He dressed simply that morning, a navy blue blazer over a crisp white dress shirt, gray slacks, no tie. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw not a Hollywood director, but a man about to walk into a battle he had never trained for. But he had trained for this his entire life. Every impossible film he had made, every studio executive who had told him his vision was too expensive, too ambitious, too crazy. Every moment he had stood alone against an industry that demanded conformity. This was just another impossible battle, and James Cameron did not lose impossible battles. The Lakewood Church building rose before him like a monument to excess. The former Compaq Center, a professional sports arena converted into a house of worship that seated 16,000 and cost $105 million to renovate. The parking lot alone could hold several small towns. James entered through the main doors, immediately struck by the production value surrounding him. Lights that belonged on Broadway. Cameras worthy of a Hollywood set. A sound system that could make a whisper reach the back row with crystal clarity. Massive screens displaying Joel's smiling face with inspirational quotes scrolling beneath. All of it paid for by people like Margaret Miller. A young staff member greeted James with an enthusiasm that felt almost aggressive. "Mr. Cameron, we are so honored to have you. Pastor Joel is so excited. This is going to be such an incredible day for God's kingdom." James nodded politely, saying nothing. His eyes scanned the backstage area, noting the security personnel, the camera positions, the emergency exits. Old habits from decades of managing complex productions. Always know your environment. Always have a plan. He was led to a green room filled with fresh flowers, expensive furniture, and a spread of gourmet food that could have fed Margaret Miller for a month. James ignored it all, sitting quietly with his worn Bible and the folder of evidence tucked inside his blazer. Through the walls, he could hear the worship music beginning, thousands of voices rising in songs about God's goodness, His faithfulness, His provision. James wondered how many of those voices belonged to people who were skipping meals to afford their offerings. How many were wearing clothes they could not really afford, driving cars they would soon lose, believing that financial struggle was a spiritual failure. The door opened and Joel Osteen himself walked in. In person, Joel was smaller than he appeared on television, but his presence filled the room like an expensive cologne. His smile was impossibly white, his suit impossibly perfect, his handshake firm and practiced. "James Cameron," Joel said, his voice carrying that famous hypnotic warmth. "What an honor to have you in God's house. Your films have inspired millions. I truly believe God has given you a gift for storytelling." James shook his hand, meeting those famous eyes with his own steady gaze. He searched for something behind the polish. Guilt, perhaps, or awareness. But all he saw was the smooth confidence of a man who had convinced himself that his lies were truth. "Thank you for having me," James replied, his voice neutral. "I have to tell you," Joel continued, settling into a chair across from James. "When I watched Titanic, I was so moved. The way you showed that love could transcend even death. That is exactly what the gospel is about. Eternal hope." James said nothing. He thought about the 1,500 people who had died on the real Titanic, many of them poor passengers locked below decks, while the wealthy escaped in half-empty lifeboats. He had made that film specifically to expose that injustice. And now Joel Osteen was sitting here, completely missing the point, just as he missed the point of everything he claimed to preach. "Well," Joel said, standing and smoothing his jacket, "I should get out there and warm up the crowd for you. When I introduce you, just come out and share whatever is on your heart. Our people are going to love you." He extended his hand again, and James took it. "Joel," James said quietly, holding the handshake a moment longer than necessary, "I want you to know that what I say out there today, I say because I believe it needs to be said. I hope you can understand that." Something flickered behind Joel's eyes. A momentary crack in the polished facade. But it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by that unshakable smile. "Of course, James. Speak your truth. That is what God's house is for." He had no idea what he had just agreed to. Through the green room monitor, James watched Joel bound onto the stage with the energy of a man half his age. The crowd erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever, a wave of adoration washing over their beloved pastor like a warm embrace. Joel raised his Bible, though James noticed he rarely actually opened it during his sermons, and declared that God wanted everyone to live in victory, in abundance, in overflow. "Some of you have been believing for a breakthrough," Joel said, his voice carrying that hypnotic cadence that had made him the most famous preacher in America. "I am here to tell you, this is your season. This is your moment. God is about to open doors no man can shut. He is about to pour out blessings you do not have room to receive." The crowd shouted their amens and raised their hands toward heaven. James watched their faces on the monitor, searching for signs of doubt, of questioning. But all he saw was desperate hope. These people wanted so badly to believe that their struggles would end, that their faithfulness would be rewarded, that God operated like a cosmic vending machine where enough coins would eventually produce the prize. As Joel continued his prosperity mantras, James noticed the offering buckets being prepared backstage, each one held by volunteers who had been trained to make eye contact, to smile warmly, to create subtle but persistent pressure for giving. He had seen similar techniques in Hollywood fundraising events, but those were for charity. This was something far more sinister, dressed in religious clothing. "Before I bring out our special guest," Joel announced, his smile somehow growing even wider, "I want to remind you that today is Seed Faith Sunday. Whatever you plant into this ministry, God will multiply back to you. I have seen it happen thousands of times. Your breakthrough is just one seed away." The offering buckets began their journey through the aisles. James watched as people reached into purses and wallets, some pulling out bills they clearly could not afford to give. An elderly woman in the front section removed what looked like her entire week's grocery money. A young man in a worn jacket hesitated, then emptied his pockets completely. James felt his resolve harden into steel. "And now," Joel said, returning to center stage, "why have someone extraordinary with us today? You know him as the visionary director behind Titanic and Avatar. He has created worlds that have inspired billions of people. But beyond his incredible talent, He is a man of deep conviction who has agreed to share something personal with us today. Please welcome the legendary James Cameron. The applause was thunderous. James rose from his seat, feeling the weight of every document in his jacket, every story he had collected, every life that had been destroyed by the man now gesturing welcomingly toward the stage. He walked out into the lights. 16,000 faces looked up at him. The cameras rolled, their red recording lights like unblinking eyes, broadcasting to millions more across the nation. James approached the microphone, shaking Joel's hand briefly before the pastor retreated to a seat behind him. For a moment, James simply stood there, letting the applause fade into expectant silence. He looked out at the sea of faces, seeing in them echoes of Margaret Miller. How many grandmothers were sitting in these seats right now, planning to give money they needed for medication? How many single mothers were calculating whether they could afford groceries after today's offering? How many young people were emptying college funds, believing a prosperity preacher over common sense? He reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter. "Before I say anything else," James began, his voice carrying clear and steady through the massive sound system, "I need to read you something." The paper trembled slightly in his hands, not from fear, but from the weight of what it represented. A woman's final testament, written in shaky handwriting, chronicling a faith that had been exploited unto death. "My mother, Margaret Miller, died believing she was cursed by God for being poor." A murmur rippled through the congregation. This was not the inspirational testimony they had expected. She gave Lakewood Church her heating money because Pastor Osteen promised that sacrificial seeds would produce a harvest. She froze to death in her apartment alone while Joel Osteen slept in his $10 million mansion. The arena fell absolutely silent. Not the expectant quiet of an audience waiting for the next line, but the crushing silence of 16,000 people processing words they had never expected to hear in this place. James continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. She had given $900 a month for 6 months. Every penny of her Social Security. She ate 1 meal a day to save money for offerings. She stopped taking her heart medication because she believed Pastor Joel when he said that doubt was robbing her of her blessings. He looked up from the letter, scanning the stunned faces before him. Margaret Miller died on January 15th when the temperature in Houston dropped to 31 degrees. Her power had been shut off for 3 days because she could not pay the bill. A woman who believed in God with all her heart, who trusted this church with everything she had, froze to death in the richest country on earth. Joel's smile had frozen on his face like a mask that no longer fit. He rose from his seat and took a step toward James, his hand reaching out as if to take the microphone. "James, I think perhaps we should." "Sit down, Joel." The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. James spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had commanded thousand-person film crews, who had convinced studios to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in his impossible visions, who had never once backed down from a fight he believed in. Joel stopped mid-step, something in James's eyes freezing him in place. A woman in the third row began to sob openly. Near the back, a man stood and walked toward the exit, his face twisted with an emotion somewhere between grief and rage. "That is a tragic story," Joel finally managed, his voice strained and thin, nothing like his usual smooth delivery. "But surely you are not suggesting that our ministry—" "I am not suggesting anything," James interrupted, his voice cutting through Joel's weak defense like a blade. "I am stating documented facts. While Margaret Miller chose between food and heating, you were standing on this stage telling people that poverty is a curse that can be broken through giving. You were promising that God rewards faith with financial blessing. You were taking money from people who could not afford to give it." The crowd stirred uneasily. Some voices shouted, "That is not true." But others remained frozen, unable to reconcile what they were hearing with what they had been taught for years. James reached into his jacket again and pulled out a folded document. This is Lakewood Church's public financial filing. Anyone can look it up. Your ministry brought in $70 million last year. $70 million. Your personal net worth is estimated at over $60 million. You own a mansion worth $10.5 million and a second home in California worth $4 million more. He let those numbers hang in the air. And Margaret Miller died without heat. A voice from somewhere in the middle of the arena called out, "How many others? How many more Margaret Millers are there?" James nodded slowly. "That is exactly the question I have spent 3 weeks trying to answer." He pulled out another letter. Thomas Wright gave his daughter's entire college fund to this church. $30,000. Because Joel promised that God would return it sevenfold. His daughter is 23 years old now. She works 2 minimum wage jobs instead of attending university. Her dreams died so Lakewood could add another zero to its bank account. Then another letter. Sarah Martinez, single mother of 2. She gave her rent money 3 months in a row because she believed the breakthrough was coming. She lost her apartment. Her children had to move in with relatives in different states. She has not seen them together in 6 months. With each story, the atmosphere in the arena grew heavier, the air itself seeming to thicken with collective grief and dawning recognition. Joel made one more attempt to salvage the situation. "These are isolated incidents," he said, his voice cracking audibly through the microphone he had grabbed from a worship leader. "Every ministry encounters people who struggle. We help thousands. Your outreach programs received less than 1% of your annual revenue." James cut him off. "I have the numbers right here. For every dollar donated to Lakewood, less than a penny went to actually helping anyone. The rest paid for this building, those cameras, your salary, your wife's salary, your children's salaries, your private jets, your luxury cars, your multiple homes." He paused, letting the mathematics of greed settle over the congregation. "You built an empire on the desperation of people like Margaret Miller. And you called it ministry." An elderly woman in the front row slowly rose to her feet. Her hands gripped the seat in front of her for support, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades. "Pastor Joel, I have been coming to this church for 12 years. I have given over $40,000. My husband died last year, and I could not afford his funeral. I had to let the county bury him because I believed you when you said my harvest was coming." Her words crashed through the arena like a tidal wave, and suddenly the dam broke. More people began standing, not to leave but to speak. "I gave my car," a young man shouted from the balcony. "I have been taking 3 buses to work for 2 years, waiting for the blessing you promised. My marriage ended." A woman sobbed from the middle section. "My husband begged me to stop giving so much. You told us that was the devil trying to steal our blessing. Now my children do not have a father at home." One by one, stories poured forth like blood from wounds that had been hidden for far too long. The arena transformed from a temple of prosperity theology into a confessional of broken dreams and shattered faith. James stepped back from the microphone, watching as truth spread through the congregation like wildfire. He had expected resistance, denial, maybe even violence. What he had not expected was this, a mass unburdening, years of suppressed doubt finally finding voice. Joel stood paralyzed on the stage, watching his carefully constructed kingdom begin to crumble. His security team looked to him for direction, but he had none to give. For the first time in his life, Joel Osteen had no smooth words, no polished phrases, no scripture twisted to serve his purposes. He was witnessing the beginning of the end. And James Cameron was just getting started. James reached into his jacket one final time and pulled out his phone. The arena had grown quiet again. 16,000 people waiting with bated breath to see what other secrets the Hollywood director had brought into their sanctuary. "There is something else," James said, his voice echoing through the vast space. "Something that proves this was never an accident. Never a good ministry that simply lost its way." He connected his phone to the sound system. The technical staff, still operating on autopilot, allowed the connection without question. "This is a recording from someone who worked inside Lakewood for 15 years. Someone who saw the inner workings of this ministry. Someone who finally found the courage to speak." Linda Patterson's voice filled the arena, clear and damning. "I was Lakewood's chief financial officer for 15 years. I watched as we developed strategies specifically targeting the elderly, the sick, and the desperate. We had profiles on every major donor. Single mothers were encouraged to give during back to school season when they were most stressed about money. Elderly members received extra phone calls during Social Security deposit dates. We tracked giving patterns and identified when people were most emotionally vulnerable." Gasps rippled through the congregation like wind through wheat. On stage, Joel's face had transformed from red to a shun white. The recording continued, Linda's voice steady despite the weight of her confession. "We were trained to use specific phrases. Your breakthrough is just one seed away. Do not let doubt rob your harvest. Give in faith, not in fear." We knew these phrases bypassed logical thinking and triggered emotional responses. It was psychological manipulation disguised as ministry. And Joel knew. He approved every strategy. He celebrated our extraction rates in private meetings. James stopped the recording and looked directly at Joel. "You knew exactly what you were doing. Every widow's last dollar. Every desperate parent's grocery money. Every sick person's medication fund. You took it all, and you called it God's work." Joel's composure shattered completely. He turned to his security team with wild eyes. "Security," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Cut the cameras. Clear the building. Get him off my stage." But something extraordinary happened. The security team did not move. The head of security, a broad, shouldered man named Marcus who had worked at Lakewood for 8 years, stepped forward. His face was twisted with an emotion that looked like liberation. "I am sorry, Pastor Joel," Marcus said, his voice carrying through the microphone he had grabbed. "But I cannot do this anymore. My own mother gave her last $1,000 to this church last month. She is eating cat food to survive. Cat food. While you drive a Ferrari." One by one, Lakewood staff members began removing their name badges and placing them on the stage. The worship team leader, the youth pastor, administrative assistants, technical crew members, a mass exodus of conscience playing out in real time before millions of viewers. A young man in a Lakewood staff shirt walked onto the stage carrying a cardboard box. His hands trembled, but his voice was strong. "Pastor Joel, these are letters we were instructed to throw away. Thousands of them. From people begging for help, for prayer, for just enough money to survive another month. You told us to destroy them because, and I quote, poverty mindset is contagious." He overturned the box. Letters cascaded across the stage like a paper waterfall, a flood of desperate pleas that had been silenced and discarded while Joel preached about abundance. A woman rushed onto the stage and began gathering the letters, reading names aloud. Maria Gonzalez needed money for insulin. David Parker was facing eviction. Jennifer Williams could not afford her son's cancer treatment. Each name hung in the air, like an accusation from beyond the grave. How many of these people had died waiting for help that never came? How many had lost their homes, their health, their hope while Lakewood's bank accounts swelled? Joel finally found his voice, though it came out weak and defensive. "You do not understand how ministry works. These people, if we helped everyone who asked, you would have to sell one of your mansions." James finished for him. "You would have to fly commercial instead of private. You would have to live like the carpenter's son you claim to follow." The truth of it was mathematically undeniable. $70 million a year could have heated every cold apartment in Joel's congregation, could have filled every empty refrigerator, could have paid for every desperate medical need. Instead, it had built an empire of empty promises and purchased a lifestyle of obscene luxury. A voice from the sound booth suddenly announced through the speakers, "For anyone watching online, we are now displaying Lakewood's internal financial records on the main screens." The arena's massive displays lit up with spreadsheets, receipts, and internal memos. Another conscience-driven defector was exposing everything in real time. The documents revealed what the public filings had only hinted at: Joel's annual compensation of $12 million, Victoria's $8 million, their adult children employed at six-figure salaries for vague consulting roles, expense accounts covering designer clothes, luxury vacations, private chef services. The church's benevolence fund, supposedly dedicated to helping struggling members, contained less than $50,000. The budget for Joel's wardrobe alone exceeded that amount. Victoria Osteen emerged from backstage, her designer heels clicking against the floor like gunshots. Her face was a mask of fury as she grabbed a microphone. "This is an attack from Satan," she declared, her voice shrill and desperate. "James Cameron is a false prophet sent to destroy God's work. Do not listen to his lies. The enemy wants to steal your faith." But her words fell flat against the weight of evidence displayed on every screen. The congregation had seen too much. The numbers did not lie. The letters did not lie. The testimonies of broken people throughout the arena did not lie. An usher in his 70s approached the stage with slow, deliberate steps. He reached into his wallet and removed a $100 bill, holding it up for everyone to see. "This was for today's offering," he said, his voice carrying surprising strength. "I have been giving to this church for 30 years. Never missed a Sunday." Then he walked to a homeless woman who had been sitting quietly in the back row, someone who had wandered in seeking shelter from the Houston heat. He pressed the money into her weathered hands. This is what Jesus would actually want. The gesture sparked something that spread through the arena like holy fire. Throughout the congregation, people began pulling out their wallets and checkbooks. But not for Lakewood. They turned to each other, to those sitting nearby who they knew were struggling. A wealthy businessman in an expensive suit walked across the aisle and handed his Rolex to a young father who had earlier confessed to working 3 jobs. A woman removed her diamond earrings and gave them to a single mother clutching her children's hands. Cash passed from those who had to those who needed, reversing the flow of money that had always moved in one direction. Joel watched his congregation transform before his eyes. These people who had lined his pockets for decades were finally practicing what he had only preached: sacrificial giving, unconditional generosity, love without expectation of return. Everything he had built was collapsing, and something beautiful was rising from the ruins. "Stop this," Victoria screamed, her composure completely gone. "You are being deceived. God wants you blessed. God wants you prosperous. Do not throw away your inheritance." James turned to address her directly, his voice calm but cutting. "Ma'am, with respect, you are wearing shoes that cost more than Margaret Miller had to live on for 3 months. Your husband drives a Ferrari while telling people that their poverty means God does not love them. Which deception are we really talking about?" The live broadcast continued streaming to millions. Social media exploded with shares, comments, and reactions. The hashtag Margaret Miller began trending worldwide within minutes. News networks interrupted their programming to cover what was unfolding at Lakewood and in megachurches across America. Congregations watching the live stream began turning to their own pastors with questions that had been suppressed for far too long. Then the arena's main screens flickered. The financial documents disappeared, replaced by something no one expected. A video began playing, grainy footage of an elderly man in a hospital bed, speaking directly into the camera with urgent, desperate eyes. John Osteen, Joel's father, the founder of Lakewood Church, recorded shortly before his death. "If anyone finds this after I am gone," the elder Osteen said, his voice weak but clear, "know that I fear for what Lakewood might become. My son Joel has gifts, charisma, intelligence, vision, but he has begun to love the spotlight more than the scripture. He sees the church as a business, not a body." The arena went absolutely still. 16,000 people held their breath as a dead man's prophecy played out before them. I am leaving this recording as a safeguard. If Lakewood ever stops preaching Christ crucified and starts preaching prosperity, if it ever values money over ministry, if it ever hurts the poor instead of helping them, then someone needs to stop it. John Osteen's eyes seem to look directly through time and space. "Even if that someone has to stop my own son." The video ended with the founder of Lakewood praying through tears, begging God's forgiveness for whatever role he might have played in creating the monster his church would become. Joel collapsed into a chair, his head falling into his hands. The weight of his father's words, recorded over 2 decades ago, had shattered whatever justifications he had built up over 20 years of prosperity preaching. His own father had seen this coming, had warned against it, had prayed that someone would stop it, and now, finally, someone had. The sound of sirens grew louder outside the arena, cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. Red and blue lights flickered through the glass entrance doors, casting strange shadows across the faces of 16,000 witnesses to the greatest religious scandal in American history. Houston Police Department vehicles were surrounding Lakewood Church. But they were not coming for James Cameron. They were responding to hundreds of fraud complaints being filed in real time by congregation members who had finally recognized what had been done to them. A detective entered through the main doors, badge visible on his belt, walking directly toward the stage with the confident stride of a man who had seen corruption before but perhaps never on this scale. "Mr. Osteen," the detective announced, his voice amplified by a microphone handed to him by a cooperative sound technician. "I am Detective Raymond Martinez, Houston Financial Crimes Division. We need to discuss the multiple allegations being reported against you and your organization." Joel looked up from his hands, his face a ruin of the polished image he had cultivated for 2 decades. The man who had smiled his way through interviews, controversies, and criticism now looked utterly broken. But before the detective could continue, a commotion erupted near the back of the arena. A group of well-dressed men and women were pushing through the crowd, their expensive suits and urgent expressions marking them as representatives of other prosperity ministries. James recognized some of them from his research. Associates of Kenneth Copeland, representatives from Creflo Dollar's organization, members of Benny Hinn's inner circle. They had been watching the broadcast and rushed to Lakewood to perform damage control, desperate to prevent the contagion of truth from spreading to their own empires. "This is spiritual warfare," one of them shouted, attempting to command the room with practiced authority. "Satan is attacking God's anointed. Do not be deceived by this Hollywood manipulation." But their words bounced harmlessly off the congregation's newfound awareness. The spell that had held these people for years, for decades in some cases, had been irreversibly broken. James stepped forward to address the prosperity preachers directly. "Gentlemen, you have built the same golden calves, just in different cities. You have all perverted the gospel into a pyramid scheme where the only ones who prosper are at the top. Today it is Joel's empire falling. Tomorrow, it might be yours." One of Copeland's representatives, a man whose suit probably cost more than Margaret Miller's annual income, pointed an accusing finger at James. "You have no authority here. You are just a filmmaker. What do you know about ministry? About scripture? About the things of God?" James smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You are absolutely right. I am just a filmmaker, but I have spent years researching the life of Jesus for various projects. I have read every word attributed to him in the Gospels. And nowhere, in any of my research, did I find Jesus promising material wealth for spiritual obedience. Nowhere did he say give to get. In fact, he warned specifically about people like you. He opened his worn Bible, the pages falling naturally to a passage he had read hundreds of times. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. James looked up, his blue eyes sweeping across the prosperity preachers. What fruits have you produced? Broken families, empty bank accounts, desperate people eating cat food while you fly private jets. Margaret Miller, frozen in her apartment, clutching a Bible that promised her treasures in heaven while you stole everything she had on earth. The Copeland representative's face turned purple with rage, but before he could respond, something unexpected drew everyone's attention back to the stage. Joel Osteen was standing. His posture had changed. The defensive hunch was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. As if a weight he had been carrying for 20 years had finally become too heavy, and surrendering it was the only way to survive. "They are right," Joel said, his voice barely recognizable. Stripped of its practiced smoothness, it sounded human for the first time. All of it? Everything James Cameron has said, everything in those documents, everything my father warned about. Victoria grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into his sleeve. "Joel, stop. You are destroying everything we have built, everything we have worked for." He turned to look at his wife, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, that the marriage built on mutual ambition had nothing left to stand on. "Everything we built deserves to be destroyed," Joel said quietly. "It was built on lies, on manipulation, on the corpses of people like Margaret Miller." He stepped away from Victoria and approached the front of the stage, looking out at the 16,000 faces that had trusted him, funded him, believed in him. "I stood on this stage for 20 years telling you that poverty was a curse, that wealth was God's blessing, that your financial struggles meant you lacked faith. I watched people give their last dollars, their rent money, their children's futures, and I told them they were planting seeds that God would multiply." His voice cracked, but he pushed forward. "I knew it was not true. I knew from the beginning. But the money kept coming, and the crowds kept growing, and I convinced myself that I was special, that the rules did not apply to me, that God had chosen me for something different." He pulled out his phone and held it up. "This morning, before I came here, I checked my bank balance. $63 million in personal assets. $63 million, while Margaret Miller could not afford to keep her heat on." The number hung in the air like an obscenity. "I am going to liquidate everything," Joel continued. "The mansions, the cars, the investments, all of it. Every penny will go to a fund for people who were harmed by prosperity theology. It will not bring Margaret Miller back. It will not undo the damage I have caused. But it is where I have to start." Victoria's scream of protest cut through the arena. "You cannot do this. That money is ours. We earned it." Joel turned to face her one last time. "We did not earn anything, Victoria. We took it. From people who trusted us. From people who believed our lies. That is not earning. That is stealing. And I am done." She stared at him for a long moment, her perfectly made, up face contorting through a series of emotions before settling on cold fury. Then she turned and walked off the stage, her heels echoing through the arena like a final judgment. She would file for divorce within the week, attempting to protect whatever assets she could. But the legal battles ahead would strip away everything the Osteens had accumulated over 2 decades of prosperity preaching. Detective Martinez stepped forward again. "Mr. Osteen, we need you to come with us for formal questioning. Given the circumstances, I would recommend you contact an attorney." Joel nodded slowly, seeming almost grateful for the structure the legal process would provide. "I understand, but may I address the congregation one more time?" They deserve to hear something real from me. Maybe for the first time ever. The detective considered for a moment, then nodded. Joel walked to the center of the stage, standing in the spotlight that had once made him feel like a king. Now it felt like exposure, like truth. I stand before you a fraud. For 20 years, I took your money and your trust and your faith, and I gave you nothing real in return. I told you God operated like a vending machine. Put in enough coins, get out your blessing, but that was never the gospel. That was a con. He paused, gathering himself for what came next. The Jesus I claimed to represent had no place to lay his head. He told a rich young ruler to sell everything and give to the poor. He said it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a wealthy person to enter heaven. And I ignored all of that because it did not fit the business model. Tears were streaming down his face now, cutting tracks through the television makeup. If there is anything left of your faith after what I have done to it, hold on to that. But build it on something real this time. Build it on service, not success, on sacrifice, not seed faith, on love that expects nothing in return. He looked at James, who stood watching with an expression that held no triumph, only sadness. Thank you, Joel said to him, for doing what my father prayed someone would do, for stopping me before I destroyed any more lives. Detective Martinez gently took Joel's arm. We need to go now, Mr. Osteen. As Joel was led away, he passed through the congregation that had worshipped him for 2 decades. Some people turned away, unable to look at him. Others reached out to touch his arm, offering forgiveness he had not yet earned but desperately needed. An elderly woman stepped into his path. She was frail, her clothes worn, her hands trembling. "Pastor Joel," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I gave you $30,000 over 10 years, my husband's life insurance. I do not want it back. It is gone. But I want you to know something." Joel stopped, unable to move, unable to breathe. "I forgive you. Because if I do not forgive, I will be just as lost as you have been. And I refuse to let what you did turn me into something ugly." Her words broke something inside Joel Osteen that had been calcified for years. He fell to his knees in the aisles, sobbing openly, as the woman he had robbed placed her weathered hand on his head and prayed over him. It was not absolution. He would still face prosecution. He would still serve time. He would still carry the weight of every life his greed had destroyed. But in that moment, something that looked like grace flowed through Lakewood Church for perhaps the first time in its history. And James Cameron watched, realizing that he had come to expose corruption but had witnessed something far more profound. The possibility of redemption, even for those who seem beyond saving. The weeks that followed transformed the landscape of American Christianity in ways no one could have predicted. Joel Osteen's arrest made international headlines. The trial exposed decades of financial manipulation, psychological exploitation, and systematic fraud disguised as ministry. Prosecutors presented evidence that Linda Patterson and other former employees had provided, painting a picture of an organization designed from its foundation to extract maximum wealth from vulnerable believers. The courtroom was packed every day. Victims traveled from across the country to watch justice unfold, many of them clutching letters they had written to Lakewood years ago, letters that had been thrown away unopened. James Cameron testified on the 3rd day of the trial. He sat in the witness box and recounted everything, from Sarah Miller's tearful confession about her mother's death to the mountain of evidence he had assembled with Kevin Rhodes's help. His voice remained steady throughout, even when the defense attorney attempted to paint him as a Hollywood elitist with an agenda against religion. "I have no agenda against religion," James responded calmly. "I have an agenda against exploitation, against greed dressed in holy clothing, against men who steal from widows and call it God's work." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: financial fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, tax evasion. The judge sentenced Joel Osteen to 7 years in federal prison, a sentence that sent shockwaves through prosperity ministries nationwide. But something unexpected happened during Joel's time behind bars. Stripped of his mansions, his Ferrari, his private jets, and his carefully constructed image, he found something he had lost decades ago, or perhaps something he had never truly possessed. Faith. Real faith. The kind that did not require a $10 million mansion. The kind that flourished in a 6-by-8 cell with a metal toilet and a thin mattress. Joel began leading Bible studies for fellow inmates, teaching not prosperity theology but the actual words of Jesus, the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Guards reported that the former prosperity preacher spent hours each day writing letters to people his ministry had harmed. Each letter contained a personal apology, a confession of specific wrongdoing, and whatever money he could earn from his prison job. 40 cents an hour, adding up to a few dollars each week. Nothing compared to the millions he had taken. But everything he had left to give. The Lakewood building itself underwent a transformation that Margaret Miller would have appreciated. True to Joel's promise, his liquidated assets funded the conversion of the former Compaq Center into something radically different. The Margaret Miller Community Center opened its doors 6 months after the trial concluded. Sarah Miller, Margaret's daughter who had worked on James's production team for years, cut the ribbon with tears streaming down her face. The massive arena that had once hosted prosperity sermons now housed a free food distribution center serving 3,000 families every week. A medical clinic staffed by volunteer doctors provided care to anyone who walked through the doors. No questions asked, no donations requested. Job training programs filled classrooms where worship teams had once rehearsed their perfectly choreographed performances. There were no offering buckets anywhere in the building. No seed faith appeals. No promises that giving would unlock divine blessing. Just help, freely given to anyone who needed it. James Cameron attended the opening ceremony, but declined all requests to speak. This was not his story anymore. It belonged to the people who had been hurt and were now being healed. It belonged to the volunteers who showed up every day to serve without expectation of reward. It belonged to Sarah Miller, who had channeled her grief into something beautiful. The ripple effects spread far beyond Houston. Congregation members across America began demanding transparency from their churches. Financial records that had been hidden for years were suddenly open to public scrutiny. Pastors who had lived in luxury while their members struggled found themselves facing uncomfortable questions. Kenneth Copeland's ministry lost 90% of its donor base within 18 months. Creflo Dollar quietly stepped down from his pulpit after his own congregation confronted him with the evidence James had presented. Benny Hinn announced his retirement, disappearing from public life entirely. The era of prosperity preaching was not entirely dead, but it had been mortally wounded. A generation of believers who had been taught that their poverty was a spiritual failure began to understand that they had been victims of a sophisticated con. Many left organized religion entirely, too wounded to trust again. But others found their way to smaller churches, quieter congregations where pastors drove used cars and lived in modest homes and actually knew the names of their members. 1 year after the Lakewood confrontation, James received a letter postmarked from a federal correctional facility in Texas. He recognized Joel's handwriting on the envelope, though it looked different somehow. Less polished. More human. Dear James, the letter began. I have started this letter 100 times and thrown it away 100 times. Nothing I write seems adequate. How do you apologize for what I did? How do you make amends for Margaret Miller and thousands of others like her? The answer is you cannot. Some debts are too large to ever be repaid. But my father, before he died, told me that grace was not about deserving. It was about receiving what you could never earn. I did not understand that when he said it. I thought I understood grace, but I only understood transactions. Give to get. Plant to harvest. That is not grace. That is commerce. Real grace is the woman in my congregation who forgave me when I had stolen everything she had. Real grace is the inmates here who pray with me, even though they know what I did. Real grace is you, James, doing what needed to be done, even though it would have been easier to stay silent. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I have not earned it. But I wanted you to know that the man you confronted that day no longer exists. I do not know who I am becoming, but I know who I am no longer willing to be. Thank you for stopping me. My father asked God to send someone to stop me before it was too late. I believe God sent you. With sincere gratitude, Joel. James read the letter 3 times, then placed it in a drawer with other correspondence he had received since that Sunday in Houston. Letters from victims thanking him. Letters from pastors who had changed their approach to ministry. Letters from people who had recovered their faith after years of spiritual abuse. He never responded to Joel's letter. Some wounds took longer to heal than others, and James was not certain he had the right to offer absolution that was not his to give. But he thought about it often. 2 years later, James stood on his Malibu deck, watching the sun sink into the Pacific Ocean. The same view that had witnessed his darkest moments of grief over Margaret Miller's death now carried a different quality. Not peace exactly, but something approaching resolution. Sarah Miller had called that afternoon with news. The Margaret Miller Community Center had just served its 1 millionth meal. They were expanding into a second building, funded entirely by donations from people who had been inspired by her mother's story. A story of tragedy transformed into triumph. Robert Mitchell, James's old friend, joined him on the deck as the last light faded from the sky. Any regrets? Robert asked, handing James a glass of scotch. James considered the question carefully. The past 2 years had been complicated. He had made powerful enemies, received threats, lost some friendships with people who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. No, he finally answered. Not a single one. Robert nodded, settling into the chair beside him. You know what struck me most about that whole thing? Robert said. It was not the corruption or the money or even Joel's confession. It was what happened afterward. The congregation turning to each other instead of the offering plate. People giving directly to those in need without expecting anything back. That moment when real Christianity broke out in the middle of all that fake Christianity. James smiled, remembering the businessman handing his Rolex to a struggling father. The woman giving her earrings to a single mother. The $100 bill pressed into a homeless woman's hands. That is what Margaret Miller would have wanted, James said quietly. Not revenge, not destruction, just truth, and maybe a little grace. The stars were emerging now, pinpricks of light in the vast darkness above. James thought about all the people out there who were still trapped in prosperity theology. Still giving money they could not afford. Still believing their poverty was a punishment from God. The fight was not over. It would never truly be over. But something had shifted that day in Houston. A crack had formed in the foundation of an empire built on exploitation. And through that crack, light was finally beginning to pour through. James raised his glass toward the darkening sky. To Margaret Miller, he said, and to everyone brave enough to tell the truth. Robert raised his glass as well. To truth, he echoed. They drank in companionable silence as night settled over Malibu. 2 old friends who had witnessed something extraordinary and emerged on the other side changed. Because that is what truth does. It changes things. Sometimes it destroys empires. Sometimes it builds something better in their place. And sometimes, if we are very lucky, it sets us free. Thank you for following this story! Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you would like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next chapter we are preparing for you.